Thanks for inviting me and having me here. So I'll begin with a little bit of Oblivion, and then I'll try to synthesize the three very diverse presentations we heard by actually talking about some of my ideas and then adding them to those topics. But in terms of Oblivion, as Boris mentioned, I teach in FUGA, and actually there the memory of Hungary has been forgotten. Right now the big debates are about the Italian legacy and those relationships, but this whole Hungarian period has pretty much been forgotten, even though they basically constructed the port, and there are some initiatives for this industrial heritage. So I call upon architects, historians, artists from Hungary who like to come to FUGA and do research, because I think there is a lot of opportunity and to really show all those layers of Rijeka. And the second part of Oblivion and memory is that the new campus university where I teach is actually built on the former site of an army barracks built by Austria-Hungary, and then the Italians occupied it, and then it was the Yugoslav People's Army had it there, and actually it was named after Spanish volunteers in the Spanish Civil War, and that's now been mostly leveled and building up this new buildings, looking forward to the future and education. So we're on the foundation of something that's also been erased. And I'll also begin, because I would like to maybe bring our discussion back to some of the things we were talking about yesterday, which I thought was really quite dynamic. And I've just been to New York and in Lithuania and also in Dublin and all these history conferences about memory, and I think it was very refreshing to get some theory and some artists. And so I'll try to end with a little bit of culture, maybe raise some questions. What can we do as activists, not just passive observers of this memory revision? And to begin with is almost a response to Boris's comment yesterday when you were mentioning that even the SDP, the leftists in Croatia, were saying, yeah, let's look to the future, there's this horizon, and that it was sort of kind of false. And I would say, in a way, before the EU, that was the general discourse. Croatia is moving forward, the EU is this amazing place of economic growth and so on. Croats have been, well, disappointed quite a bit since then, or maybe even it was more of a meh kind of reaction because not much has changed. But instead of looking forward, we are wallowing now in the past. And as we heard earlier today also with this rehabilitation of General Draža in Serbia, there is a lot of discussion of the past, and in a way the right-wing discourse, they're actually looking to 1991 as this golden era of unity. A lot of people are saying, remember how great it was during the war when we were all united, which is kind of a perverse statement to make. There's another moment that is focused upon that was also discussed by Gaspar yesterday, and what this panel is also about Trianon, and Trianon has this focus of also Hungarian collective memory, and I would say in Croatia now we're also looking back to 45 and this trauma, the opening of wounds, but I'll get back to that in a little bit. So about the three papers or the presentations, which were quite diverse, and it's actually going to be a real challenge to connect them, but I mean we had a very intense historical analysis and then a discussion of how that is actually memorialized to the examples of this memory or monument boom that we see in Budapest, and then finally also a discussion of the churches and the religion, and also using maybe, I guess, popular culture in a way, because we saw those videos as a way to convey some of these memory issues. And perhaps for that final comment is we're looking at who are these memory agents, who are these actors in society that are working, because it's not always just top down from the state. Of course the state plays a big role, but we see all these bottom up challenges. So I guess to begin with my first theme of, and what Daniel was talking about, we see how complicated the history is. I mean, this was like, a list of battles, violence, ethnic groups fighting each other, and then I think that's actually the difficulty in memorializing it. How does each of those stories get memorialized? Because I think part of memory work, and I guess I could also say transitional justice in a way, is giving recognition to various victims. And one of the comments you mentioned is discussing, I think, Snyder's book, which was that the collaborators have this idea that they were forced into it by the Germans. And this was very relevant a few weeks ago when the Croatian president went to Jasenovac concentration camp a few days before the official commemoration and wrote in the book this camp is evidence of Nazi fascism and the German domination, without mentioning the Ustascha, who were actually the ones doing the murdering there, or who, so the real perpetrators weren't mentioned, and who the real victims were, because the majority of victims were Serbs, not Jews, even though they were quite numerous there. So we see this sort of, losing the accountability for domestic perpetrators, which is kind of whitewashing this all. And this is going to my comments yesterday, which was the appropriation of anti-fascism by the pro-fascist groups. And I spoke about that one monument in Split that was built with the social democratic mayor actually opening it. And what I didn't mention, which is quite perverse, several perversities about that event. First of all, it was on the day of victory over fascism. So last year, May 9th, it was unveiled, a monument with the name of an Ustascha general on it, with paramilitary forces, who actually, not only did they dress in black and made fascist statements, they actually expelled Serbs living in the block around there. They were chased out of their apartments, they were expelled, they were either, because of their Serbs or associated with the army. So we're not talking just about mythical relationships with a fascist past, but paramilitary units that were actually committing, I don't know if we're going to call them war crimes, but committing crimes during the 1990s, and then building a monument in front of those apartments where these same crimes were perpetrated, and then claiming, well, we're actually anti-fascists because we fought Milosevic's fascism. So it's very, very complicated, because these terms we were using yesterday, fascism and anti-fascism, perhaps we need to find some other ways, because if we're always just focusing on the World War II ways and the historic notions, I think it's very difficult to move forward, because someone's always going to say, well, Tito was a criminal, and no, Pavlaković is a criminal, and the Ustascha and the partisans, and we're not really moving forward to deal with the actual problems of contemporary extreme nationalism. Again, one argument is, well, the Ustascha state wasn't fascist because they banned the fascist party. Well, that's a pretty lame excuse, because if you walk like a duck and talk like a duck, I mean, it's probably a duck, even if it's banning the fascist party. And so that's one argument that is used quite a bit. And so to go on to a contemporary event, I also mentioned briefly yesterday that there's a number of veterans from the war in the 1990s also protesting in Croatia in front of the actual ministry. And if anti-fascists and fascists are now equated, all that's left really are the communists, and the communists are the enemy. And if you would go to this protest in front of the Ministry of Veteran Affairs, and the minister is actually a veteran from Vukovar, like the most sacred place in Croatian recent history, who spent time in a Serbian camp afterwards. So, I mean, this guy, he is a legitimate veteran, so they're protesting, and the posters they say are, we're against Yugoslavia and Yugoslavs, and we're against communists. There's a big sign, Smrt komunizmu. So these guys are actually living in the past, because there's no real communists, but that's what's going on. Okay, there wasn't anti-fascism, there were communists. Communists committed massive war crimes, especially after the war, because the Ustascha actually surrendered on May 15th. So between May 9th, the official day, and May 15th when they surrendered, they consider this post-war crimes, even though they had continued fighting. So we've got crimes, and then we've got the 1990s, and then we have the Reformed Social Democratic Party, which is the inheritor of the Communist Party. So basically they're using the past to attack contemporary leftists as communists. And as I also mentioned yesterday, the EU resolutions are very handy here, because if you say that Tito was a Stalinist, and Stalin committed all these big crimes, and the EU has condemned Stalinist crimes, then we should condemn the left wing in Croatia. And why World War II? And one of the arguments is, I think we also mentioned a little bit, and especially I think Rastko's work on this contemporary post-socialist fascism, is because actually the HDZ, the right wing, and the SDP, the left wing, are exactly the same in their economic policies. There's no difference, so they really can't. And actually the former prime minister is in prison for corruption. He's the HDZ guy, so they're not going to use an economic argument, but they will use World War II ideological divisions to keep this going on. And there's also a fragmentation of the Yugoslav narrative, because each state now has their own national version of World War II. So that's kind of, just going back to what Daniel was saying, the complexity of World War II, how do we deal with it? And that brings us to my second point, and with the discussion of the monuments, which we saw quite a lot of, and I also photograph a lot of monuments. People who follow me on Facebook know that I have a huge archive, and so it was very, very interesting. And in a way, maybe what I'd like to talk is also some of the new stuff I'm looking at is this lost cause idea. And this is not in Zizek's defense of lost causes, but I'm talking about the American South, and a way in which commemorative practices organized by the memory agents, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and Southern Baptist priests who had often served as chaplains in Confederate units, begin initially a very sort of neutral commemoration of the fallen Confederacy, the ones who supported slavery, which grew into this lost cause myth that it wasn't about slavery, it was about state rights, and the South was morally wrong, was morally correct. The North just had more people, and there were these evil capitalists who just had better railroads than we did and more manpower. But we were right. It was the mythic South, and I'm trying to also apply some of this lost cause ideology also to what this Ustasha rehabilitation is going on, because it's not just about remembering the victims of communist repression. It was also about rehabilitating the Ustasha state, which they weren't that bad. They weren't really fascists or Nazis. They were just Croatian patriots who were anti-communists. And so it's okay to build monuments to them, and there are hundreds of monuments now built to the other side. And that's maybe a second point within this kind of thematic block, is how do we commemorate the other side, the side that lost? Because in a way, I mean, they do deserve some monument, or at least a grave marker and some dignity, but what happens when it becomes like the lost cause in the South, and you have another 100 years of Jim Crow laws and using memorialization of the Confederacy to justify continued repression, nationalism, racism, segregation, which the Civil War, you could say, maybe ended in 1964 with the Civil Rights Movement. Or if we're looking at Ferguson, maybe it really hasn't ended. So it's that difficult challenge of how do you commemorate both sides. And in Croatia, the policy was blow up the communist one and then you build the other side one there. Maybe my third point within this cluster is this idea of victimization, because it's much better to focus on 1945 when the Ustasha are the victims, rather than 1941, and what they were doing was setting up concentration camps, racial laws, sending units to the Eastern Front with the German units, and so on. So 45 as this mythical way to kind of become a victim, because it's pretty good to be a victim, and where communist monuments or the partisan monuments usually had fallen fighters and then victims of fascist terror. And now these new memorials are, and these were mostly soldiers, many of them Ustasha, some of them were Domobrans, many who didn't even die in Croatia or former Yugoslavia, but on places like the Eastern Front. Now their memorial to soldiers says also victims of Serbo-Chetnik Yugo-Bolshevik terror. So soldiers fallen in battle have now become victims, and it's this victimization narrative. And again, this is kind of the blending of the fascism, anti-fascism, and then victim and perpetrator. And sort of just like end with this memorialization politics. And one comment was that the head of the opposition party, Tomislav Karamarko, who 2013 on the 23rd of August, so commemorating victims of all totalitarian regimes, went to a commemoration, laid some flowers, and said, "I'm offended when people call me an anti-fascist because I'm mostly an anti-communist." So we already saw the beginning of this shift, which is now moving forward. And finally, this is not directly, I don't know how much related this is to Tony's presentation. Where is this? Oh, back there. Because there was a lot of micro detail on some of that, but what interested me most was this cultural, or using pop culture of some of these songs and these like new interpretations. And I guess what it made me think of also is, how are we going to deal with this rehabilitation? Does it mean that we're going to build many new monuments? Do we need to continue this monument boom? Do we have to like recognize every single victim? I guess also a footnote to this counter memorial. There was an attempt now to build monuments to Serb civilians killed in Croatia, and a counter memorial was a bench in a village, Gošić, where a number of elderly Serb civilians were killed. And it was an architect from Zagreb, and he builds it as this bench around a tree, so gathering, so it's not one of these like classic monuments. And the names are down there. The problem is the local animals defecate and urinate on that monument because it's built too close to the ground. So someone coming from the city had no idea that this monument would now be actually problematic in the village setting. So he had to like redo the monument. But that's maybe a problem when we over-intellectualize some of these ideas, and then when it's applied in the village, then it actually doesn't really work as well. But maybe instead of all these like monuments, is culture the way to move forward? And sometimes I feel also in Croatia, I mean, there's a lot of lectures, performances, and so on, but it seems to be like drawing the same crowd. Where do the people who need to be changed? And again, these videos made me think of one of the most popular rock singers in Croatia. It's Marko Perković Thompson, who, and his images and close ties to the church and the text of his songs, I wouldn't call it fascist, but it's certainly lowering your immunity to fascism. So when the time comes, the people who are fans of these, and they're already wearing black shirts, and they're already hearing about the fuzzy borders of the Croatian state, and lots of talk about the red dragon and the traitors and so on, which is perpetuated. And when the grandfather hid the black shirt in the attic in 1945 and so on. So it's already, we're lowering the tolerance, because I actually went to his hometown Čavoglave on Victory Day with my research team, and it was 100,000 people, which was way more than the official state commemoration, and people were buying into it. I mean, they believed in it. The flags are waving. So popular culture is a way that the right has used effectively. And to resist and to, I guess, kind of wrapping it up in terms of anti-fascism, the one sort of, I guess, last bastion that or something that's positive in Croatia is this director, Oliver Frljić. I don't know if people from the region may have heard of him, and he's now the head of the Rijeka theater, the state theater there, and has like produced a number of very provocative plays. And most of his plays, the audience is sitting on the stage with the actors, so that is, you feel it on your skin. And his latest one is called Hrvatsko glumište, so like the Croatian theater. So it's not directly talking about fascism, but if you're on the stage, the people are dressed in Ustaša uniforms and they're in your face. And then at the end, it's a big Croatian flag, the contemporary one. So it's saying, you know, Ustaša or fascism isn't just because you have a U or a black shirt, it can take many other forms. And I think maybe the cultural scene also has to continue working. I don't really have a conclusion or an answer, but I think that you know, perhaps there is some kind of activism that can take place through the cultural sphere. So anyway, hopefully that was my job today.
Thank you. Thank you. We will join you now and continue the discussion.
I thought that it is very symbolic that we are sitting here in Budapest, in an monumented city between Germany, between Russia, between Ukraine, and between Croatia, in real Central Europe, and it is a very controversial history and very controversial past. And we are just after the 9th of May, after the triumph of the Second World War, and so I think it's hardly symbolic that we have this discussion here today. We are told us that 1991 was the golden era of unity. It is really, unity is a golden era for historians and artists, and could be much more interesting when a political, theological, religious, or ethnic diversity came into cracks. So is it the unity, the golden era? Is that your statement?
Hello. Are you asking if I believe that, or is that what they believe?
I ask all of you.
Okay. Well, I certainly don't believe in it, and I think that's a warning sign when you see the politicians arguing for national unity. I think that's a sign of actual danger. And again, the fact that 91 and like the worst crisis and of the killings and all that people remember fondly that era. And I was also talking about yesterday this 100% for unity movement, 100% for Croatia, this unity movement, and these meetings and stuff also funded and driven by the veterans. I think it's a very problematic episode because of the images that they're using. And they're also drawing upon Franjo Tuđman, that's the first Croatian president, because he had this all-Croatian national reconciliation idea. And his idea was that the sons and daughters of Ustaša and partisans could join together, put away the past. The problem is, of course, that now you have the new enemy, and that was to, well, Yugoslavs and Serbs and other people. So it's very, 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 very problematic. And this path from the EU, which, you know, Croatia was being monitored, and we had reformed, the right wing had reformed, and we all thought we were going to this bright future, maybe like Fukuyama's also we were discussing yesterday, but in fact, we realized suddenly, and this was on the cover of a number of magazines, 90 su opet ovdje, the 90s are back. So in a way, they are getting what they're wanting or demanding, in a way, unfortunately.
I think it was a moment of unity, but first of all, unity is always fleeting, and number two, unity often just is the moment before everything breaks up and people start squabbling and arguing. In the United States, there's something called the September 12th movement, and that refers to the fantastic unity that existed after 9/11, the day after 9/11. And of course, that was disastrous because unity meant unity behind the war drive of George W. Bush and the others in his cabinet. And so the unity that existed in 91 or 89 was this unity behind this very egotistical sense of national self-determination, which could only end in chaos, and especially in this part of the world where nations are interpenetrated, and you clearly need some kind of higher democratic authority to adjudicate and organize the affairs of nations, which the Soviets did try to do. They failed, but they did try to do something to create a democratic community of nations.
Maybe I could add, what I also find interesting is not only national unity, but transnational unity. Like precisely, Daniel, you were depicting this world of Timothy Snyder. You know, it was suddenly a unity of suffering beyond differences of all these people somewhere in these bloodlands who were squeezed between two totalitarianisms as innocent victims, unified and now commemorating, orchestrated by United States and the new hegemony, commemorating this suffering. My question is, and you know, this is one form of unity. Another form of unity is, you mentioned it also in Germany, you know, putting a German soldier and, you know, together, victim. This is mentioning Franjo Tuđman. He had the idea of mixing bones of partisans and Ustašas, you know, together in the concentration camp. So this idea of mixing all in this completely abstract concept of victim, of innocent victim, beyond the differences between victim and perpetrator, but beyond, and you mentioned it, even those killed in fighting were now victims, and this is some sort of new universal transnational space of victimization that replaces, and I'll come back to the start of our discussion, this sense of historicity, this sense of different powers, struggles, of changing hegemonies, etc. It is, in a sense, post-historical perspective, so that you can have these abstract unities of suffering also here in Hungary.
Yes, Reinhard Hozerbeck had a good word for it. It was Opferbrei.
Which is?
Which is áldozatkás.
It's a victim stew or
Stew,
something.
yes.
Victim stew, like food.
Yes, it was in connection with this memorial, with the Neue Wache, called it Opferbrei. But I was thinking about the unity in 1991 in Hungary and about the memorials here, and I feel that was a real unity at that time, because we have two fantastic public works or memorials and public works from that time, and everything is attacked in Hungary from right wing or from the left wing. But these two works are from the 1991, 1992 or 93. They wasn't attacked since then. The first one is the Central Memorial for the victims of the 1956 revolution in the cemetery from Jovanovic. This is an abstract monument. Jovanovic is politically active now. He is one of the initiators of this living memorial project on the Freedom Square, but he wasn't ever attacked because of this monument, or not so.
Because of the political unity, or
from the unity of that time, I think.
it is just the unity after the disaster.
Yeah.
Yes, the other one is from Tamás Szentjóvi, who put on the freedom sculpture or the freedom memorial at the top of the Gellért Hill. He wrapped it in a white canvas like a ghost, and it was unprecedented, and I can't imagine that now it's real. Can somebody realize such a project in Hungary? It was that time normal. So it was a fruit of the unity, I think, or maybe not.
So there are only a few fruits of the unity, but
Well,
there are many of the diversity. So it's for the artistic level or to write the history, it's better to live in confrontations.
I think the important thing about this sense of victimhood, generalized victimhood, is that it's a form of self-absolution. Victims are martyrs, and martyrs are saints, and therefore you can't say anything bad about victims. So they're absolved of their sins, and so they're freed of responsibility. With regard to Trianon, the Hungarians don't have to talk about the forced Magyarization that took place, that was imposed upon other minorities, in the years before 1914, which created the hateful atmosphere, which then led to the anti-Magyar movement of other nationalists. And similarly, the peoples of caught in between Germany and Russia, or the Soviet Union, whom Snyder celebrates. He celebrates and he mourns them and portrays them as martyrs, also to absolve them responsibility, because whatever bad happens there is the result of two outside powers, the Nazis and the Soviets, and the people in between are completely innocent, and therefore whatever they do now is entirely justified. So Bandera has been absolved, and the Home Army has been absolved, and we now blame only the Nazis and Soviets.
What I found very interesting, we mentioned very concretely the case of Ernst Nolte in the 80s in Germany. He published his article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. It's sort of conservative German, And at that time, immediately, Habermas published a response in Die Zeit, which is left liberal. And in fact, during the 80s, one can say, observing this struggle in the German public, that historical revisionism lost the first battle because the German enlightened left liberal intelligentsia was strong, dominating still the public space, and could defend some of major norms, looking forward into the rationality of communicative communication in the interaction, as was the liberal ideal of democratic at that time. It is a time when oppositions to, also in former Yugoslavia, not this right fascist opposition to communism, but this left opposition to communism also somehow believed in this ideal of public space that will be able to tame these wild powers from the dark of the fascist past. This has been, we know now, it is illusion. This liberal left, enlightened, strong, public dominating agency called rationality, liberal democratic normativity, has been essentially weakened. Habermas is old also, and now this is the space that is completely opened, and there is actually ideologically not a strong power or not a subject capable of response and to defend. This is something what I think is new.
The historical strike was washed away by '89. I mean, I don't know if people here are familiar with this, but Ernst Nolte's thesis is really very simple. Hitler was an anti-communist who went too far. So therefore his crimes were quantitative, not qualitative. He just got carried away. And he was crushed by the left, the torrent of left criticism that descended upon him, and rightly so. It was a great victory, but this came to a halt in '89, because suddenly in '89 a very different force was triumphant, and that was the theme of dual totalitarianism, where you had these two powers, morally equal, indistinguishable. The Cold War was simply an interregnum in the anti-totalitarian struggle, and once the Cold War was over and '89 to '91 had occurred, final victory was achieved, and victory against totalitarianism. And that was not Habermas's point, and that was not the point of the historical strike, but that was the viewpoint that was triumphant a short time later. And now what we see a fundamental intellectual shift, ideological shift, towards a basic acceptance on some ground of fascism, or partial acceptance, or movement towards acceptance, which I think is what you describe in Croatia, where the Ustasha has been normalized, and people feel comfortable, bringing out their black shirts and putting up statues, and well, we're not really fascist, but we have to sort of commemorate their heroism and appreciate what they did and what they were trying to do.
Well, also maybe just on the other side with the partisans and the left, especially in Croatia, the left was compromised because it associated with communism and Yugoslavism and Serbian domination, where I think maybe in other parts of former Yugoslavia, it's not so compromised. And so when the 2000s really was a way to re-nationalize the partisans because they had been so demonized in the 90s. But and in one way that is a positive effect, but now it was a desperate attempt by former President Mélyi and Josipović and the left-wing politicians, but it's really to say, okay, no, really, people like the Croatian partisans also fought for Croatia and all these things, but the negative aspect of that was that now the Serbs were completely also removed from that, and that old motto of brotherhood and unity, which had become so worn out in the 80s, but in general, it actually was a positive emancipatory move. And if we're talking about commemorative politics, and now in the last couple of years, the celebrations of 1941, which were the uprising, which was the resistance, which was this, again, emancipatory movement, there have been now staged counter commemorations by the right, because at every partisan kind of commemoration, the right says no, it was accompanied by murders against Croats, whether it's in Sisak, they have a counter commemoration in this mass grave of József. So the same day, the anti-fascist struggle day, there's a counter commemoration. And then in Srb, which is in July, they have a counter commemoration. Actually there, guys show up with loudspeakers, they actually play Thompson really loud. So there's these battles not just between historians or politicians, but on the field of battle. You have these two groups separated by a line of police. So taking away that positive emancipatory narrative, and now it's all this victimization narrative. And again, I mean, this goes into the Croatian Catholic Church, which also has a history of suffering and dying for the Croatian state, whether it's Frankopan and Zrinski, Radić, Stepinac, etc. Now it's just a new line of martyrs to build the state.
I think this is a good point. This is about religion, and I would really like to come to your presentation, because I think it is extremely interesting, and although it doesn't seem connected to the topic of historical revisionism, I think it is in a very interesting way good contribution to our discussion. Look, we mentioned Habermas. Habermas is, besides John Rawls, the major Western liberal theorist of a secularism, as Habermas defined it, in a post-secular age. What is a post-secular age? This is when religion comes, so to say, historically back. It claims more and more, and now when we ask, what does this returning religion actually claim? More space. This is how both Rawls and Habermas understand the post-secular move, post-secular transformation. The religion beliefs, and religion communities want more public space. So, and both actually Rawls and Habermas, after 90, they started to respond to and adapting their theories to new claims, religious claims, moving the line or the boundary between private and public, giving more space to these religious beliefs, and retreating. Finally, Habermas, in his last text on secularism, says it is only institution that should be defended, or more precisely, only the language of the institution. This is where the secularism still survives. The rest, it could be occupied by religious belief. And he even believes that religious beliefs are a reservoir of deep moral values, etc., etc. What you offered, and what I think is more productive, you describe this post-secularism as internal transformation within the what is believed and how it is articulated. But what is my major point your approach is in a way cultural pessimistic. You look at, you say if they will go that way, churches will, stay empty. And I meant at that time, well, this was the dream. How beautiful, this is precisely what they want. But obviously, do you really believe that there is this sort of original essence of a belief that should be kept alive and saved from these changes, which are political hegemony, the result of a struggle for political hegemony and adapting to new power relations?
Cultural pessimism, yes, and just to clarify a misunderstanding, I didn't say if, I'm saying it is going to happen, in the sense that, not because, I can understand the reaction, yeah, it's good because the churches are empty, but this time the churches are empty because there are no more Christians, not because they left, not because they stopped believing or having the faith. No, I'm not advocating, for me there is no hope in fixing this situation. The situation is as it is. These churches, smaller churches, they feel so vulnerable that they are rewriting their history and consequently eliminating what makes them, what distinguishes them, what makes them unique, right? In order to protect themselves. So, to protect themselves, they are erasing themselves. And what interests me the most is not the belief of people, if they believe in this or that, if they believe in one nature or two natures. They can believe whatever they want. What I think is almost a crime is the fact that there are, the iconography and the liturgy, and it's so beautiful, right? As I'm talking from a very secular point of view, from an artistic point of view. You saw the icons. These icons are so amazing, and these are being replaced by these reproductions of, this Virgin Mary wearing blue, having blue eyes. So how do you not see something in front of you being completely destroyed and you don't react? But wait. My second point is also an extremely important one for me. It is this idea that, because sometimes people say, but you talk about religion, a lot of people think, this is why I started by saying I'm not religious, and I say it again. So they think it's because I want to do a church revival or something. That's not the point. The thing is, I forgot my point. The thing is, there is a major problem in understanding this phenomenon, because as we wrote in the correspondence, I didn't have time to talk about this, both ISIS and what the Catholic Church is doing, willingly or consciously or unconsciously, is a result of capitalism. It's the result of the homogenizing power of capitalism. Everything has to be homogeneous, right? So even cultural identity, so you are allowed a cultural identity, right? But this cultural identity is like any other cultural identity, in the sense that what is left is only the empty shell. So everything which has content is eliminated, and only the surface remains. So if you ask people on the street, in Lebanon, people are very, this discourse, this religious discourse is everywhere. In Lebanon, now in Syria, in Iraq, everywhere, right? So you have to respond to it. So you ask people, anyone, people who are not necessarily intellectual. You have two persons, one is a Christian Maronite and another one is a Christian Orthodox. You ask them, what is the difference between the Orthodoxy and... They don't know. They know that, like for the Orthodox, they do this and they go from right to left. They don't even know why it's right to left. And the Maronites, they do this and they go from left to right, for instance. Or they, very simple on the surface things, but they don't know how deep the difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy is. With Jody yesterday, we were talking about the idea of the transcendence of God and the idea of the immanence of God. The immanence of God is the Catholic invention. It's a beautiful invention, because the immanence of God means that God is immanent in the world. So if you rationally, as a human being, start thinking about God's creation, you can understand rationally God's plan, not God's essence, but God's plan. In the three religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, God is transcendent. You cannot understand it. Your rationality has nothing to do with it. So in Islam they say Allahu Ta'ala, which is a very beautiful expression, which means Allahu Ta'ala. So God is always higher. So no matter how high you aspire, God will always be one step in front of you. So these are like major differences that people don't know about. But they know that they are different from the other. This is what I'm trying to of course this is the beginning, right? I'm still at the beginning of this research. I don't know what to do with all this stuff yet. But I showed you that what I collected, right? What I'm going to do with them later on will depend not on, I don't want it to sound like I want to advocate some sort of return to, let's all pray and become no, but as I said, the only way that the Orthodox Church is surviving is because of extreme conservatism. You cannot touch anything. If you touch this, no, you cannot touch it. If this is the way, well, okay.
Just one joke. What is different between one now Serbian bishop, in fact Orthodox bishop, explained what was the difference in the 80s in Bosnia between Orthodox, Catholics, and Muslims. Orthodox liked hard rock. The Muslims blues and blues derivatives, and Catholics new wave. This was how he explained. This is not a joke. Jovan, yes, yeah, we know who. So,
I don't know.
So,
yeah, we have 10 minutes back, so we can give the floor for the audience, and if you have any question or reflect or something.
I think for me, one thing that springs to mind here is, of course, the relationship between representation and representation. The fact that I think this has specifically to do with memorials, also with history writing, that you, in order to represent one thing, you have to represent another thing. And then I think this is actually what's at play, also in this notion of war of memory. So I would like to return again to the kind of political states, as much as the political states, in revisiting the past, revisiting history, and the notion of war of memory. Do so by being your understudy for it, and remind you of a fantastic theory that I think, observation that I think is actually what's at stake in what we're trying to do these 2 days, which has to do also with the notion of the future and the horizon that we talked about, and the temporal location of utopia. And this idea that you have presented to me many times, but we didn't discuss now, that utopia is now placed in the past, not in the future. So in order to achieve utopia, we have to go back into the future and rewrite it. And I think we find that both in reactionary policies, and we also find it in this left-wing melancholia derived from America, etc. So I was wondering if you would all discuss this proposition a little bit. Maybe you start there.
I used the notion coined by Inge Arns, you are here, which is a retrotopia, but I turned it into completely different way. But this is originally from her work on NSK and New Slovenian art, and it has this retro, retro avant-garde movements from the 80s. How I understand it, it is this thesis that we live in a post-utopian age, meaning now we see reality as it really is, and utopia is this, the world of illusion, ideological world of the world of ideological illusions. We are liberated from ideology and utopia, etc. What I find it, and this is what is my point. It is not only that utopia is still alive, but it is not turned to the future, but to the past. What happened is this transformation that utopia has lost its social meaning. It is society is no longer the medium of its realization, of the dreams. It's not about dreams about better society, but it is a cultural form of cultural production, what I mentioned, of different pasts, of different cultures, as I would say. So that this obsession with the past, obsession shared by so much of contemporary art, but also these monuments and this actually stakes in politics. You know, what are stakes today? Stakes are what happened 45, what happened at 10, etc., etc. This is where the battle is fought on this ground. It has been made possible after historiography, as knowledge supposed to know the truth, to be competent when it comes to the truth of the past, has lost this competency and has been replaced by various forms of memory cultures, commemoration. I just reminded that Pierre Nora calls our age the age of commemoration, and precisely defines, this is the 70s, this is this coincidence that we have during the 70s, probably much more interesting decade than the 90s. We have turned to the neoliberal politics, neoliberal in three major locations, which is not only Margaret Thatcher, but Deng Xiaoping's 79 wins his battle against the so-called Gang of Four, the Orthodox communists, and then 2 years later, Ronald Reagan. This change. At the same time, François Furet publishes his book Baiser la Révolution Française, saying practically revolution is over. We are not talking about revolution. French nation is not only 200 years old, but 1,000 years old. It was an event, but bloody event. We should, a traumatic event. We should cure our traumas. This is what French Revolution is about. Lost completely any political meaning, and when Nora says history has been replaced by memory. And what is memory? It's cultural practices and art and public space, reconfiguration of public space with this and that, monuments and etc. So on.
I want to say something in response to this idea of representation, depresentation that you spoke of. You know, in icons, an icon is not a representation of something. It cannot be. It's not like in the Platonic model of representation. It's the idea taking form. It's like Christ took form in the body of Jesus, right? So the Word took the form of flesh. So the icon operates in the same way. It is not a representation, it is the first image of. Exactly like when, what's her name, put the towel on Jesus' face, or like Saint Luke, who is said to have drawn the first image of the Theotokos, of the Mary. Why am I saying this? Because if you think of Isis, Isis is not a representation of something. It's rather what it aspires to, is to become the first image of the time of the prophet. So they are the embodiment of the time of the prophet, the way they understand it. So in a way, in a sense, they are living, the temporality that they are proposing is a perpetual now. Nothing happened. So there was the time of the prophet, 1,500 years later, we are resuming from when that time stopped. And we are resuming this time, not to go into the future or that doesn't exist, to remain in a perpetual present, which is not even a past, it's like the perpetual moment. So in a way, this other model of thinking about images, not representation but icons, the first image of, suits people like ISIS much more than I don't want to use the Western model, but like the European model after the Renaissance, this idea of representing something so you have the original and then you are making a copy of the original. See? Just a proposition, like not about Yugoslavia, not about Hungary, but about Mali.
I think this idea of retrotopia is really universal these days. I mean, everyone has their own version of it. From ISIS to the United States, where the retrotopia was in the founding fathers, and everything was fine, and we deviated and descended from that state, sure every right-wing movement in Europe has a similar kind of golden age mythology, and I think I think you're absolutely right. It's the fact that social movements, that people have lost their optimism. Society is no longer a solution. It's a form of corruption, of falling away, and that's this retrotopian spirit is a indication of a deep political enervation and retrograde tendency.
It is the notion of a perpetual present. This is what I would call, this is the temporality of the museum of history in which we live. Just to remind you, a German cultural theorist, Hartmut Rosa, explains it in the German concept, rasender Stillstand, which is frenetic standstill. Frenetic, which means it's a total acceleration frantic. Frantic.
Yes.
Total acceleration of so-called events of the time. At the same time, nothing really changes. Nothing essentially changes, and it is absolute standstill. He calls it perpetual present as the temporality, and all other dimensions of time. They don't exist in time, within this temporality. They must be, it can be, culturally created as a cultural difference.
So, Jody, this is why I say that ISIS is absolutely contemporary. It's not from the past. It's not like...
Which is...
It's fine, I'm done.
I agree.
Isn't it the case that this thing of the communist and the fascist all to blame, that the new dominant ideology, which has been proliferated by a non-existent organization, is ideology.
Is what?
The new dominant ideology is there must be no ideology.
Yeah.
And that's how come we have the communists and the fascists. The crime was ideology. Ideas, look what these people did. They went crazy because they were full of an idea. And in Britain, they say the same with any Muslim activity, any political activity connected to Islam. We don't talk to them about why they're doing it. We just need to know that they're consumed with ideology. This is the problem. And so, the kids, when we went to I went to the Buchenwald with the kids recently, Bauhaus, and you see when they come out and thinking, they're all lighting their cigarettes and thinking, thank Christ we don't have ideology anymore, eh? And they're just going to party tonight. And is this, am I talking about something that's a common belief?
Yeah.
I want to push against your perpetual present and your Hartmut Rosa's kind of frenetic standstill. And I think that we're seeing something else now, right? And I think that the folks who are talking about climate change and the Anthropocene are giving us a glimpse of where that is, and that this is a geologic time frame that has history, but it's not necessarily a human history, or it's recognizing human history within a time frame that involves eons. And so it's not the same as the kind of, a detailed human history, but it's also not the same as a complete present. It's tied to versions of the future, most of which are scary, terrifying, crisis-ridden, filled with extinction, but that also is tied to some kind of sci-fi versions of the future. So I think that rather than getting bogged down in the right-wing ideology of commemoration victims, what we should have for discussions among leftist and artistic intellectuals is something else, and that would be much more attuned to these to the changes that are happening in our very notions of time that are going on right now.
First of all, the gentleman over here, you're right, of course. I mean, ideology is now seen as a burden that's been thankfully cast off, but also at the same time, it's an equal and opposite trend in conservative thought, which is to deny that ideology is a force in its own right. I mean, Snyder, for example, in his book, denies there's an ideological component to the Nazi Soviet struggle, which to me is just mind-boggling. But it's because they were both evil, therefore they didn't really believe in anything other than evilness, Dr. Evil. And so on one hand, they're glad to be rid of ideology, and on the other hand, they disparage ideology and deny that anybody ever was ideological. And then Jody, I think that what you're saying is interesting. I think that's one of the reasons I have a lot of problems with the climate change movement, because it also is an attempt, it's kind of a rejection of politics in favor of some kind of geologic long view, geologic time, which lasts.
It's not a rejection of politics.
Well, that's what I fear it may be. And if you only think of the future in terms of ice ages and glaciers retreating or advancing, whatever, I mean you sort of deny the importance of human events, and of course, and you deny politics as a way of analyzing climate change and why that's taking place. That's it.
I think the projections thought that climate change is equitable and equitable. I think it's of anything the thing that will hopefully catalyze internationally to overcome differences. I mean, it's very hard to see, but it will get to a point. I think it's not anti-humanist at all. I think it's climate change movements are incredibly pro-humanist, or maybe balance in this post-humanist sense of what we are becoming with this inkling of the earth. I think if anything, climate change is giving a hope to kind of, like I say, come together in this political movement that is perhaps beyond these dialectic of things that we're caught up in. I mean, I don't know how, but this is, I would think, the next future.
Well, just a comment. I mean, I also think it's the way forward is not to out-commemorate the other guys, because I think that it's just a downward spiral. But so not completely ignoring it, but also turning to some other options. And I'm just also going to give a small example from my university where the students were finally able to organize and do something, because they're quite apathetic in Croatia. It's all about the economy's never going to get better. We're going to move out, and trying to get students to do anything other than just pass the exams is very difficult. And what unified them was not my classes on memory, we're going to go to these monuments and all this other stuff that I work on, but was actually setting up a student garden. And now it was very proactive, and they brought a lot of people together, and it was great to finally see students looking forward to something. I don't know if it's a horizon or environment, and now because this landscape of the former barracks is a wasteland. If Americans come to this is not a campus, this is a construction site, but now students are taking things in their own hand, they're being proactive, they're organizing, they're writing projects, they're bringing the city involved, they've got some guys building these drywall and whatnot. So I do think that maybe is a positive way forward to bring people together. I don't know. I don't want to just sound like Croatia is this fascist, raving, insane place, but there's some hope.
You're completely right. It's more divided than ever, which is a good thing.
Yes, unity is bad, division is good.
Yes. Shall we close?
So shall we close?
Yes.
Because
yes.
we have to respect the time, as we discussed about time always. So thank you for the discussion, and thank you for the response.